Good afternoon and welcome to Election Bites, bite-sized conversations for your lunch hour. My name is Avery Davis-Roberts and I'm your host for today's conversation on recounts and audits. And we are very fortunate to be joined today by Kevin Johnson, who is the founder and executive director of the Election Reformers Network, which is a research and advocacy nonprofit that brings a global perspective to U.S. democracy challenges. He is also a member of the Carter Center's Election Expert Study Team and has been working in reform for elections in our country for 20 years. Welcome, Kevin.
Thank you, Avery. Great to be here.
We're so glad to have you. So maybe we should just jump right into it with kind of a technical question. Kevin, what is the difference between an audit and a recount?
All right, good question. So recounts happen only when results are so close, under 5% or under a half a percentage point of all votes cast, for example, so close that there might have been a mistake that led to the wrong winner. And so recounts are designed to address that problem and be sure that the right winner has been named. Audits, on the other hand, happen every election, and they're really the election administration system's way of making sure everything's working right. I mean, sometimes the two can overlap because when you check your systems, you might find things that are close to what a recount would find, but that's the main difference between the two.
Thanks. That's a very helpful overview, especially being based in Georgia as we are, where we will be having both an audit and potentially a recount. It's
Exciting
helpful to know
time.
the difference.
Yeah.
Very exciting.
Yeah.
So sort of elaborating on that, Kevin, could you tell us more about some of the ways that audits and recounts can promote transparency in the election process?
Yes, they're really important from that regard. For one, political party representatives of candidates are a part of these processes. They are invited to observe. With recounts, they often are part of the teams that will judge any votes that are in question, and they get to see the whole thing. Beyond just that level, the public at large is invited to observe. These are open to the public events. And in addition, it creates transparency, just the fact that laws have these structures that make sure the results are right. And then I think the fourth level of transparency comes from the fact that the track record of recounts that have taken place have actually found a remarkably small degree of error to give us confidence generally in the way our elections are working kind of on the average year when there might not be a recount because it might not be close enough.
That's very helpful. I guess, there's a lot of questions about recounts that end up being kind of practical questions. Maybe you could help with some of those too. You sort of talked about, the percentage margin between the two contestants and how that might be grounds for a recount. But are there other times that recounts are required? When do they happen in the election process? Can I request a recount or can...
Avery, I'm sorry, you cannot request a recount unless you're a candidate. So become a candidate. I think you'd be very good. So I'd vote for you, even though I'm out of state. But recounts can happen in three different situations. One, many states require a recount to happen automatically if the margin is below a certain level, whether that's a half a percentage point, a quarter of a percentage point, it depends on state law. Two, recounts can happen when a candidate petitions for it. So we're probably going to have two presidential recounts this year, one in Georgia and one in Wisconsin. And actually both are going to be conducted at the request, likely, of the Trump campaign. The third way a recount can happen would be if a judge orders a recount as a part of what's called a contestation, which is the former filing of allegations of fraud that happen, and in the course of those court hearings, a judge may say, we need to go back and count certain ballots from certain areas to make sure nothing happened there.
And so all of these processes, different kinds of recounts happen after the results are sort of completely officially certified, or?
Generally, it depends by state, but in most states that's the case. So both Wisconsin and Georgia, where recounts are likely to happen this year, in Georgia, it will be after the results are certified, which I believe is November 20th. And at that point, the losing candidate can file a petition to hold a recount, which the Trump campaign has said it will do. In Wisconsin, it's close. It's after every county has completed and submitted its results, but the results aren't yet certified. But effectively, when the county levels have done their work, then the recount window opens.
Okay. Another example of the United States having wildly different rules depending on where you are.
We wouldn't expect it to be the same. Yeah.
Yes. So what happens in a recount? Like what is recounted? How are ballots recount? What happens?
So there's a range. There's some states where a recount effectively means not much more than taking the totals that you got sort of precinct by precinct when you did the original count, adding them up again and making sure they come out to the same. That's basically what happened in Florida in 2000 when the results there were very close. A more sophisticated approach is that, and this is the way it'll work in Georgia, is that all the ballots are taken and re-scanned. They're run through the scanning machines that were used originally to count the ballots, and then that total will appear, and you'll be able to see if there is any difference between that recount total and the original total. Wisconsin will sometimes actually do a hand recount, which is another level of sort of intensity of review. And also, Wisconsin's procedure does include things like whether votes that were disallowed because of, say, signatures on an absentee ballot envelope, whether those decisions were made correctly. It will make sure that there are the same number of absentee ballot applications as there are absentee ballots. So different states have a greater or lesser degree of range of things they cover in a recount.
Interesting. And then sort of what happens when the recount is over? Does it impact the end result of the election often?
Not very often, but it certainly has happened. I mean, probably the most noteworthy example, the governor's election in Washington in 2004, that at the end, when the results were certified, about 2 weeks after election day, the Republican candidate was up by about 250 votes. There was a recount, and enough votes were found that hadn't been counted correctly, mostly because some voters' names were not entered into the registration list purely by clerical error, and so they were not allowed to vote. And once that error was found, their provisional ballots were counted, and that was enough to make the difference. And so once that difference is determined, then it becomes the new certified result. Now, the candidate who became the new losing candidate in a recount can then file an appeal or a contestation. And so often it will go to court, which is not surprisingly what happened in Washington during that election. I think Georgia's had a case or two where a county election won by 6 votes by one person was recounted, and then the other person ended up winning by 1 vote. So it can happen. These things can be close sometimes.
In very, very close elections, right, yeah, it can definitely be meaningful. I guess as we're sort of wrapping up this conversation, if there was one thing that you hoped that our viewers would take away from this conversation about audits and recounts, what would it be?
You know, a lot of people talk about we need to rebuild our democracy with a notion that it used to be a lot better. But at least in the category of counting votes and checking the accuracy of results, our election system has never been as good as it is now. And in a way, the Carter Center is a nice sort of window into that, because President Carter wrote a really fascinating book about his first run for Georgia's state Senate in 1954, where, according to one chapter heading, the dead voted alphabetically. So there certainly have been situations in the past where we had much less reliability. So we should be encouraged, at least by the systems around our counting and recounting. They work and they're accurate and they can be relied on.
Thanks, Kevin. It's nice to end on a positive note.
For once, right?
For once, yes. So thank you so much for joining us today, Kevin. Thank you to our viewers for joining us. I hope that you will join us again on Thursday, also at 1 o'clock, when we will be getting informed, and we'll have a quick conversation on facts that we all need to know to be more informed voters and consumers of democracy. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Avery. My pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.